Um, Without further ado, our event will start. The event is being recorded, and you are at our Editors Confidential, our annual CISS session on how to publish. So I will pass the mic over to Associate Dean for the Social Sciences, Ariane Chernock, who will welcome you all.
Thanks very much, Debbie. Welcome, everybody. It's exciting that so many of you signed up for this session today on Editors Confidential, where you'll learn tricks of the trade for submitting to journals, something we all are continuing to refine at every stage of our academic journeys. And I'm sure I will learn quite a bit today as well from our exciting group of panelists. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Debbie, who will introduce our guests.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you so much for our editor panelists for joining us today. CISS is the Center for Innovation in Social Science. And so it was really important that we had multiple dimensions of the social sciences represented. So I am very delighted to introduce our four editors, very different journals who will share their wisdom today. And they'll be answering questions and then engaging with Q&A from all of you in the audience. So at any point during the session, feel free to put a question in the chat. Or at the end of our kind of formal conversation, you can raise your hand and then ask a question in real time. We'll start off with Elizabeth Cohen, who is the political theory editor of the American Journal of Political Science, which is the flagship journal of the Midwest Political Science Association. And Elizabeth is the Maxwell Professor of U.S. Citizenship in the Department of Political Science. Next, we have our sociologist, Alia Guseva, who is the chief editor of Socioeconomic Review, and she's also an associate professor and director of graduate studies in sociology. And SER, Socioeconomic Review, is the flagship journal of the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics, SASE. Then next we have Kevin Lang, our economist. Kevin was editor-in-chief of Journal of Labor Economics from 2021 to 2023. He's also the Lawrence Bloom Professor of Economics. So we can share about economics journals. And as you'll see, the journals are all similar in their approaches. And then finally, we have Zach Rossetti, who is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Education, which is actually the oldest educational publication in the country. And Zach is an associate professor of special education at Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. So the way we run this session is we have a set of kind of canned questions that we think will be of interest to many of you. And each of our expert panelists will weigh in, and they might contradict one another, which always makes for a more fun conversation. And then we'll open up the floor to all of you to ask your burning questions about how to publish. We purposely call this Editors Confidential because people will be very honest here and tell you what really happens behind the scenes when you click submit on your paper. They'll tell you what happens after you hit that click and between that time and the time that you get your decision. So without further ado, I will pass things back to Ariane to lead off with our first question.
Okay, thank you so much, Debbie. Our first question for the panelists is about how to choose a journal. And Elizabeth, we were hoping you could start us off here.
Sure. Thanks so much. And thanks to Debbie and Shannon for putting this together. I think it's super useful. And I wish that this had been available to me when I was learning how to do this. So I think there's a couple general rules of thumb that are useful as you're getting ready to both write your piece and submit. And I think as hard as it is to do, probably the first step you need to take is choose your journal before you actually write your manuscript. And I can say, in all honesty, that this is advice that I don't always follow because I get really excited about something and need to pursue it in the moment. But I'm always regretful afterwards that I didn't follow this advice because you really are writing for an audience. And different journals have different audiences. So I think you should, in an ideal world, you should familiarize yourself with journals that are likely candidates that are in your field and that publish work like yours, and ask mentors what might be suitable fit. But you should do that before you really have too much done on your manuscript. Not that you can't submit if you have already written it and haven't done that, but it's useful. I think a good rule of thumb that's almost always true is, are you citing that journal in your work. If you're not citing the journal in your work, there's a decent chance that it's not as good a fit as you might hope. Um, and if you didn't cite the journal in your manuscript, but you actually could, then after the fact, before you submit it, but after you've written it, you should go back and do that because it does signal to the editors that you're engaging with work that they publish and therefore will be of interest to their audience. I think it's also good to understand what kind of journals are out there. I edit a generalist journal. So political science has three main generalist journals: American Political Science Review, AJPS, and Journal of Politics. And we have a specific mandate, which is to publish things of interest to the field. These are the most competitive journals because everybody wants to get into the journals with the biggest audience. But writing for a generalist journal is a very specific thing. You have to be taking on kind of important arguments, big arguments, or kind of doing work that isn't extremely specific. You can then also think about subfield journals. Those to pitch themselves to very specific audiences. Those are often easier to publish in, and it's easier to identify which ones are really good. But the last thing I'll say is, you should ask yourself, do you sound when you're writing like other pieces in the journal? So read the journal that you want to submit to, and ask yourself if your manuscript sounds like other manuscripts in there. I think that's sometimes hard to see, but sometimes you can really tell that you either do fit with the journal or you're writing at a more specific level, or in a different style, and you might need to find a different journal. So that's a start to the conversation, but I'm sure there are things that I will regret having not said once everybody else starts talking.
That's excellent advice, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. Do other panelists have thoughts on this question they'd like to share?
Sure, I'll jump in. A couple of things. It sounds like in political sciences and economics, there's a somewhat vague but understood hierarchy of journals. And so if you apply at the top of the hierarchy, your chances of being accepted are generally lower, not always, but generally the case. And so you have to think about where you are in your career and the trade-off between getting something accepted right away and getting something that will be more prestigious based on where it's published. The other thing I want to say is it's good to look at what's being published there. Take account of the fact that if something very similar has been published in the journal, it actually may not be a good fit, right? So if somebody has analyzed some policy in Norway, sending me a paper that's essentially the same for Sweden is not likely to be attractive to me. On the other hand, if you write to me and you say, they did this study in Norway and I show this is not a generalizable result, that would be attractive. And I guess the last thing I would say, and I know I've been in a bunch of these editors' confidentials or similar things elsewhere, is not all editors agree, but I actually object to you telling me that this is a good fit for my journal. I think that's my job. And so you figure out whether it is. I'm going to make that decision.
Alia, do you have a comment?
I agree with everything that has been said. I actually do usually recommend to authors to look at to search recent issues of the journal that you're targeting potentially for some sort of similarities. I think, Kevin, you're right that, journal may not want to publish sort of a very similar paper unless it's in a dialogue with and kind of shows something different from what has been published. But I think generally speaking, if you're not finding any similarities between what you wrote and what the journal has published in the last 5 to 10 years by method, by topic, that's a sign that maybe this is not your journal. If you're also not citing anything from that journal. So it's sort of and a lot of papers, we will get to this later, a lot of papers I desk reject papers that clearly show me that the authors submitting the papers have never seen our journal. So they have no idea what we published, what sort of the style is and stuff like that. So that's clearly kind of a lack of fit. One specific thing I want to say is that I think, Kevin, you touched on that there's a hierarchy of journals. That's also true for sociology. And the kind of the higher impact journals, the more prestigious journals, although prestige is not only numerical, of course, prestige is also kind of like in the minds of your mentors and peers. You can also kind of gauge it this way. But the more prestigious journal, the more riskier to send it, meaning that the likelihood of actually getting an R&R is lower. So high risk, high reward. And you have to think of this also in terms of your stage in a career, like when you have time to risk it. By sending it to a high prestige journal, and when you need a kind of a surer publication, and maybe you want to kind of send it to a journal that will accept it with higher likelihood. And the other additional point to this, to add to this, is that journals oftentimes, if you go at their pages, they have a lot of useful information besides sort of this kind of the page that's specifically geared at authors, how to format your paper, all that. For example, they have sometimes the time to decision information. That's very useful. If you are kind of in a time crunch, you want to make sure that you're not sending it to the journal that for which the average time of to decision is 5 months, for example. That's just a little too long. So anything under 3 months, I would say, is good. But there are lots of sociology journals now even that kind of guarantee or promise even lower turnaround than that. And I think certainly if you are kind of on a timeline which requires you or expects you to publish quicker, you want to be paying attention to that thing. And last thing, the other useful information about the journal and how well of a fit this is, and whether this is something this is the kind of place you want to put your work in, is to look at the editorial board of the journal. The journal name may sound kind of like plausible, but if you look at the editorial board and you don't recognize any of the names, you don't cite them, you don't read them, then maybe this is not the crowd that would be most kind of welcoming to your paper, perhaps. And it's good when you see people that you read, cite, and engage with, and then you see them on the editorial board. That probably means that it's a good place for you to send your paper to.
Thanks so much. Zach, do you want to add anything?
Sure. This is a tough spot after the three other panelists here. I generally agree with uh, most of or all of what they've said, and just wanted to add to a couple. For us in special and inclusive education, the notion of kind of generalist and subfield journals is an interesting one. So there's some broad kind of cross disability journals, and then there are some of the subfield journals that focus on particular disabilities or particular levels of needs of kids. But then also, there's education journals, and some of us in special ed who focus on inclusive ed or want to reach that broader education field, or all teachers, not just other special education teachers, have that additional consideration. So I think, looking also and considering the audience that way in terms of maybe I have a study that is new and rigorous and would be of benefit to special educators and special education professors, but also exciting and new, and we want to try to reach the general education area. So I definitely I think this is an important decision. I've been part of teams and kind of written and before deciding the journal, and you always run into hiccups. I'm predominantly a qualitative researcher, and one of those hiccups is often the journal's page limit, which, generally they're similar, but sometimes they're a lot more, which is helpful when you have to write a lot about what you did and really dive into findings. Sometimes they're shorter, and even though we wanted to submit here, it's not going to work. So looking at that could be important depending on the type of study or methods you've used as well.
Thanks so much. I'll turn the conversation over to Debbie for the next question.
Great. Thank you. And actually, I'll just make one comment as an editor of Journal of Health and Social Behavior. One other piece of advice I would give on journal selection, which might be a little bit niche, but some people are writing a paper that's legitimately about two topics. So the impact of family on health, or the impact of race, ethnic status on economic factors. And so the question is, do I go to a health journal or do I go to a family journal in that first example? And my advice would be to go with whichever type of journal you lead with theoretically, the theoretical framework, rather than picking it by independent, dependent variables. So that's for folks who do that kind of work, that was just a PS. But now I will go back to my job, not as editor, but as one of the hosts of our event. And next, I'd like to talk about what are 2 to 3 main characteristics of a successful publishable manuscript. And of course, knowing it's not going to get published on that first try. So what makes for a strong manuscript? And then conversely, what would be those characteristics of a desk reject? And whoever leads off, who I think is Alia, can explain what desk reject is versus, kind of a reject with review.
All right. So right away, the desk reject is when you send a manuscript and it's not sent out to an outside reviewers, but the editors decide on to not accept the manuscript or to sort of basically terminate the process of considering it for publication for a variety of reasons. So why manuscripts are desk rejected? I think one of the most common reasons, and it's probably not only SCR, it's everywhere, is the fit. And Kevin mentioned how he doesn't want to hear that the authors convincing him that the fit is great. And I actually kind of just glaze over these cover letters that sort of basically recite back to me the mission of the journal and how it's sort of supposedly a great fit, because oftentimes it's not. And I think I want to emphasize again the importance of not only looking at the kind of the mission of the journal, but actually looking at the issue, because a lot of papers we desk reject seem to be, the name of our journal is pretty general. It's socioeconomic review. So all kinds of people think that would fit whatever they're writing on. But actually, you need to kind of get a sense of what we're publishing, what is the style of our articles, what are kind of the topics as well. I think the best way to learn is just to look at the last several issues. You don't have to read it necessarily, although that's kind of advisable. You can just skim to get a sense of what sort of papers, what sort of topics, and what sort of approaches the journal favors. And that can tell you a lot. And so a lot of people don't do this. And one of the main reasons to desk reject is fit. So sometimes it's topic, sometimes it's narrow focus. So the thing about SCR is that it's an interdisciplinary journal. We publish sociology, political science, a little bit of heterodox economics as well, meaning that our audience is very broad. It's also international journal. And so in mind with this audience, what we are looking for are papers that are framed in a broad theoretical terms that readership can kind of get around. A lot of times I actually desk reject papers with a recommendation to submit it to a specialist journal, to the point that some of you made, that it's really kind of on a very specific topic and it speaks to a very specific audience, and it simply is not going to be, it may be interesting to a very small sliver of our audience, but not to kind of broader readership. The other thing about SCR is that we sort of at least think of ourselves as a journal that fairly generalist in a sense that we are kind of looking for papers that push the theoretical envelope forward. What that means is we're looking for this theoretical kind of conceptual novelty. And so I get a lot of papers that are probably very competent papers that are what we sometimes call data forward, or they're maybe innovative in terms of their methodology. We don't really publish that. There are lots of places where you can publish this kind of work. It's just not SCR. So what we're looking for is kind of this theoretical novelty and conceptualization. And so sometimes actually looking even at the length of the paper that I get, the first thing I can see, I sort of sense already that it's unlikely to be a fit for us because it's way under our word limit, which is 10,000, which for kind of a good theoretical paper, sometimes it's not even enough. Sometimes people go overboard, and we're okay with this up to a point. So something along the lines of 6,000 words usually is too short to develop any kind of theoretical argument. And again, there are lots of journals that can publish this work, and it may be great, competent work. It's just not us. So basically, I think the three things, to go back to the question, that makes a good publishable paper at socioeconomic review is first, broad framing that can kind of speak to the readership that's international and interdisciplinary. Second, this novel theoretical contributions that are, pretty clear, and the specialist editors that I assign the paper to, who are more familiar with the specific fields or specific arguments, will then tell me whether this is a novel argument or it's kind of rehashing what's been done before. And the third thing is that, and I hear this from a lot of our editors, we're looking for papers that are free of jargon. And I think that's because certainly in the, abstract and introduction, and that's because of that interdisciplinary nature, that you cannot really speak a kind of a very niche language hoping to reach a broad audience. Again, lots of journals would publish, specialist journals would publish papers that speak to a very particular audience, but it's just not us. We want something that is a little broader in focus.
So next alphabetically, Kevin, what would you add to what Alia said about successful versus not successful manuscripts?
So what we look for, and I think it's a rephrasing of what Alia said, is we're looking for something that's going to have impact. And particularly, I would say impact per page, because Journal Labor Economics is a relatively limited number of pages that we can publish. So something that does not advance the field in a noticeable way, either in terms of technique, in terms of data, in terms of theory, is unlikely to find its way in. There are plenty of places that will accept it, but as the premier journal in the subdiscipline, that's not likely to be a good fit if it's not going to have impact. The other thing I would say, and again, I think this was implicit, if not explicit, in what Alia said, is in order to have impact, it really helps for it to be well written. And that's become a lot easier these days than it used to be. But I know that lots of economists, and I'm sure there are parallels in other fields, will spend a long time making sure that their empirical results are robust, or that their theorem is the tightest theorem that they can write. And then the paper will have 20% of the words that you could cut with absolutely no loss of content. And frequently, the last thing I did before accepting a paper was to take the first 2 or 3 paragraphs of the introduction and rewrite it with 40% fewer words and no loss of content, and then telling them to go back through the paper and cut it not with content, just cut it with excess verbiage.
Great. Next, so Zach, what would you share?
Sure, thank you. This is great. Many similar things. I mean, a clear description of the problem being addressed, a strong rationale for addressing it, rigorous methods with compelling findings. Our journal, in particular, and we mentioned this on the website, and I find that I'm always saying it as an editor, we're looking for robust implications for practice related to teaching and learning. Certainly policy, if a paper's addressing educational policy in any way, but if the journal explicitly mentions anything like that, like your paper should include it. And it's not necessarily a reason for desk reject. It's just an area for revision, possible decision of reject if there aren't robust implications for practice that you're writing about. My journal gets a lot of submissions, and so I've become stricter than I thought I might be around desk rejects for not adhering to author submission guidelines. So I think that may vary across journals or maybe not. But yeah, pay attention to those and adhere to those. Lots more people than I ever would have thought don't. Um, Formatting styles and page limits and all of these other pieces of that are really basic and just give us a reason not to send out your paper for review at times. Um, I, as a qualitative researcher, I've also noticed that there are lots of low quality qualitative papers that get submitted to our journal. I'm an associate editor for a couple of others where the analysis is very surface level and authors are calling, saying that they have themes and that their themes are this and that, and they're really just kind of categories of what participants said, organized by research questions. It's really not very rigorous or deep at all. So um, that's something that I certainly look for in any qualitative papers. And I'm happy to talk to anyone outside of this panel about that as well in more detail.
Great, thank you. Very helpful. And then last, Elizabeth, what would you add to this topic of what makes for a desk reject versus R&R or successful outcome?
Sure, thanks. There may be some differences in types of journals surfacing, so I'll just take a step back and say we have kind of a two-stage process. So we have a managing editor and then a team of editorial assistants, and they see the manuscripts before the editors ever do. And in many cases, if something is really far afield, it will get desk rejected by the team that's kind of before the editorial team, the staff. So if something really doesn't look like it kind of understands what a generalist political science article looks like, we don't see it. Similarly, the letters that I think Kevin was referring to, like explaining the article or making a pitch for it, we don't see those. Just the staff see them. So then it will also be the case that we get pieces that we look at and say, essentially, not so much this isn't exactly a fit, although that will happen sometimes, and the letters may sound like everything's not a fit that's getting desk rejected. But in some cases, we're making an assessment that, in our experience, there's almost no chance that reviewers will greenlight this. We have a very strict limit of one revision. And so if we don't think this is close enough that reviewers, after a single revise and resubmit, will greenlight it, then we're not sending it out for review. In terms of what makes a successful manuscript, I think keeping it very tight is important. So I think leanness came up, but also a tight argument, a very clear structure, and a very clear statement up front of what the contribution is. I would just temper the language that's been used a little bit, that's been used already, and just say, I wouldn't overplay the originality of the contribution in the section where you describe the contribution, because I think there's a widespread kind of cynicism that like nothing's totally original. So kind of the over claiming it really undermines your piece in a lot of people's eyes. And also, it's really important to be in conversation with other literature that the audience will be familiar with. If you're not kind of part of a conversation, it's going to be very difficult to get a manuscript across the line. That's what this is, right? Academia is largely a conversation with people around us and people who came before us. So rather than kind of trying to make a claim that like nobody's ever said anything like this before, I think it would be good to just be responding to something, adding to it, correcting something, but not overplay that. And then I would just say, in addition to kind of tightness, structure, really good lit review that situates your piece, just also tone, just trying to have a tone that matches the tone of pieces in the journal that you're targeting so that you sound like the other pieces that that journal would probably publish. Things I notice that come up a lot are, especially in less experienced authors, a very lofty tone that kind of takes the reader through with a lot of first and second person. And it just doesn't always play well with the reviewers. I don't think we have to adhere to strict rules about third person, but if you're kind of instructing your reader some of the time, which comes up a lot, it might feel better to do than it actually feels to read. So keep the tone and keep it consistent with the journal.
Thank you. I would just add to what Elizabeth said. I think the key thing is to make sure the evidence and the claims are aligned, right? So if you're going to go big in your claims, you need to make sure you're also going big in your evidence. And it's where we see a gap that I think we often run into problems. Let's turn to the revise and resubmit category, which is a complicated one. I was hoping, Kevin, you could start us off by talking about strategies for handling the revise and resubmit, which is a very common decision made on a submission.
Sure. And I think I'm going to start off the way Elizabeth started off her first answer, which is I'm very glad to be here because I can look back at the first revise and resubmit that I got, which ended up in a rejection because I had no idea how to do a revise and resubmit and didn't have anybody giving me any guidance. Situations are going to vary, and they vary across journals and they vary across editors. In my view, a good editor, when they get the referee reports, is going to tell you in the letter they send you what they think is important in the referee reports. Right? That doesn't always happen. I've seen plenty of decision letters which were basically make the referees happy. And sometimes one of them wants you to do one thing and somebody else wants you to do the opposite. Assuming that the editor has done their job, that's where you want to concentrate, but you can't ignore the rest of the referees. As I put it to my students, editors are gods, referees are demigods. You anger the gods at your risk. Right? So figure out which are the important points. Hopefully the editors helped you with that, and really focus on that. Right? In your response letter, the norm, at least, and I've seen this not just in economics, I've seen it in sociology and psychology as well, is have in two different fonts the comment that was made by the reviewer or the editor and your response. Okay. Now, there has been a trend in my field, and again, having worked with a psychologist, it seems to be true there as well, is enormously long responses. And I know from talking to other editors, that really doesn't help. Right? You want to respond to each and every point, but if you can do it briefly, do it very briefly, right? So if it's, there's a typo, you do not have to respond, oh, thank you so much for catching this error. I have changed, the spelling of two from TWO to TO. Fixed is fine. You can even say fixed for a whole bunch of very small things. I prefer as an editor that you just refer to the spot in the paper where you've made the change. I can tell you if you write 30 pages of response, I'm not going to bother reading it. Then I'm going to just go straight. It's faster for me to just go and read your paper. So respond to everything. If you get something you can't respond to, either because it's impossible, right? The data don't exist, you can't do it, be upfront about it. Occasionally, maybe not occasionally, all too frequently, the referee will be wrong. If it's a matter of opinion, then I'm going to go with the referees are demigods. If it's literally they don't understand something about the statistical technique, then you have to do your best to explain very gently that they're incorrect. And sometimes you'll just have to say, yes, it was a great idea to write another 10 pages on the policy implications of this paper, but the editor told me to cut it by 20%. So I'll be happy to add those 10 pages if the editor and the referee still want me to. But for the moment, I haven't done that. I don't know what happens if you have a strict one revision policy in such cases. We don't, although I try not to send things back to the referee. Your goal with the with your response letter is to get me to be so convinced that you've done such a great job that I don't send it back to the referees. Let me leave it at that. I've spoken too long as it is.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Would anyone else like to weigh in on this question of revising and resubmitting? Alia?
So I unfortunately have seen quite a few cases where the second revision, so the R1 after an R&R is not accepted, is rejected. And the reason for that is that the comments that were given by reviewers on the first draft were not sort of addressed. And I think it's true that sometimes papers end up being rejected because what the referees ask for is just not possible to do, whether, it's whatever that could be. And it's not always clear from the first read of the manuscript whether that can be done or not. But what I think the most upsetting is, and on a couple of occasions I've seen that when the referees get the revised manuscript and they realize that their comments were ignored, that they were not addressed, that they were not kind of taken seriously, that they were dismissed. And sort of that becomes an issue. And if the reviewer is particularly irate and very articulate about why this is a kind of a valid comment that was ignored, I don't think an editor who's a god, according to Kevin, can overlook that. I think we typically, unless this is something that you know as an editor really, really well yourself, and you can kind of have an independent judgment, most of the time we outsource the evaluation to people who are actually experts in that particular area. And so if they're really not convinced that kind of dismissing that argument or saying that this is irrelevant or that's, that what I've done is the way to do it, is just kind of a road to nowhere, essentially. And it doesn't happen often, but sometimes, and sometimes actually it happens maybe because the authors did not take the response to reviewers too seriously. Like it sounded like they kind of dismissed or overlooked particular comments. And I can tell you that the reviewers do not take this well. Reviewers spend a lot of time reading your papers and commenting on them. And basically not engaging with their comments seriously kind of invalidates that or devalues that labor that they put in. And and so you want to, it's not necessarily pleasing the reviewers, but you want to kind of have an intellectual exchange with them and engage seriously with what they propose. That is my advice. And that's where I see kind of the most surprising sometimes rejections after review, where, the paper came in and the reviewers really did not sort of see it as,
Yeah, I just want to mention, I did say that referees are demigods.
Okay, so there's power there too. Yeah.
Thanks both.
I'll just add something really quickly, which is the response letter is its own art. And so you're going to have a deadline for the revise and resubmit. First of all, I can't speak for anyone else, but I am pretty sure that almost all of those deadlines are extendable. And I know at our journal, we have almost indefinite extensions. It's just not an important deadline unless the editorial team is turning over, in which case you have a very strong interest in getting it in with plenty of time for that editorial team to handle it, because the next team may not, have the same view of the reviews that the team that gave you the revise and resubmit does. But so you may find that you spend most of your time before the deadline or up until the deadline, you're actually going to meet writing the revisions. But the letters should take some time. If you're not spending a fair amount of time on it, then you may not be giving it the kind of attention it needs. I can't speak for the editors or gods thing, but I really would urge everybody to be extremely deferential to reviewers and to speak to each reviewer as if they are an individual person and you are addressing them, because treating them and their work with respect and a fair amount of deference is going to put them in a state of mind that is far more favorable than any of the other options. So I just want to, those are the only points I have to add.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
I'll add a couple more things as well quickly. I definitely agree with everything that's been said. We don't want to see a 30-page response, but certainly deferential and specific. And so pointing, I think Kevin said this, pointing to where the changes were made, including the page number, a brief thank you, and we made these changes or parts of these changes on this page and parts on this page. That's kind of what we're generally wanting to see. In my field, we generally see this in a table. So all of the editorial and then referee comments with a response next to it by the author. And one piece of advice, I generally adhere to this myself when I'm writing, is to include all of the feedback, including the neutral or positive, especially the positive feedback. And it can be helpful as an author to, not over the top and disingenuous, but to, thank them for the feedback and remind them that even though there are these suggested revisions, that they also liked a lot of the paper, and that there is some, merit here. So that's one quick strategy. These should take a while, as Elizabeth said. So it's good practice to, whether it is a letter with different font or a table, to start this right away as soon as possible after you get the decision. And I'd make that draft and start filling it out with your team, or as soon as possible. And it can get a little tricky. You want to respond to everything, and definitely try to respond to everything and respect the reviewers and the editorial decision or guidance. You also need to stay generally within the page limit. I mean, I've seen some papers and had authors argue, well, I got so much feedback, I had to go 20 pages over the limit. And so it is your responsibility as the author to edit for concision or figure out the best way to make it all work. It's not necessarily our job to do that for you. So that's a piece of this as well.
Thanks, Zach. Debbie, back to you.
Great. I would just add a couple tiny things about the memo. Like, I totally agree that no one wants to read a 30-page revision memo. But there are some cases, especially for quantitative researchers, that you're going to want to add tables into your revision memo. For sometimes a reviewer will ask to see much more analysis and it just won't fit in the actual paper. So that's another place that you might kind of beef it up a little bit. And I think the memo is really important because it helps anchor you, right? You'll get all these reviews. And one strategy I learned when I was starting out is to transcribe those reviews and make them your to-do list. And that's the shell of the revision memo. And so for that reason, you'll have your paraphrased words summarizing their comment that you can address. But if it is a reviewer who used unkind language, you don't have to keep reading it and undermining your morale. You'll have your summary of what they said to do. And so the memo really can be very constructive as a to-do list. And then on the point of timing, I agree with Elizabeth, it might take time and you can always ask for an extension, and you should if you absolutely need it, but then you run the risk of one of your original reviewers being no longer available, right? We tend to send your paper to 3 reviewers and we hope those exact same 3 will read the revision. And sometimes, they have a baby, they're traveling, and so they can't review your revision. And we try not to bring in a new reviewer with new concerns, but sometimes we just have to do it if too much time passes. So you want to take as much time as you need, but try to avoid stretching it out too long because then the reviewer base shifts and they're less emotionally invested. They forgot about your paper if it comes in 9 months later. They'll remember it if it comes in 2 months later. So I would just add those couple little points regarding the R&R strategy. But now I will go to our next question, right? So you've gotten your R&R, you have these 2, 3, or 4 sets of reviews. Who are these reviewers? And so maybe Zach can lead off and tell us, how do you choose reviewers for a manuscript that you're sending out?
Sure. Most journals have an editorial board, an established set of reviewers who are professors in the field who have published or are publishing in the journal, and kind of balance the topics and methodological areas that are usually published in the journal. We have about 65 member editorial board now. I want to bump it up a little more because we get so many submissions. But when we first get a manuscript, you start by sending out requests to reviewers with expertise in the content area, and or methods. And if it's separate people, just making sure those are covered. And if one accepts and one doesn't, finding someone else for, the method or the content, whatever's, not covered there. We Most journals, I think, have a statistician or several, depending on the types of articles. And so if it's especially complex in terms of research design or statistical analyses, they'll be one of the reviewers. It can be challenging at times to find reviewers, and so sometimes I don't know if others have done this, but I've gone beyond the editorial board. There are some suggestions within our the platform that our journal's on, Sage, sort of hit or miss. I generally use those only as necessary. And I or associate editors will also reach out to colleagues who we know have content or methodological expertise at times for particular papers. Can I just add 2 quick things for anyone who's going to be a reviewer? 2 really quick pieces of advice that I think are generally helpful for us as editors. It's okay if you say no, but just say no quickly. When we're trying to find secure reviewers for a manuscript, it is so hard when it's been a couple of weeks and then you say no. I'd rather have a response in 24, 48 hours, even if it's a no, and then I can keep plugging away. And if you do have to say no, if you can suggest another reviewer or 2, that's also super helpful.
Great. Thank you for raising that, because some of our audience members who are on the newer author side might want to start reviewing because it gives them insights into the process. So thank you for reminding us of that. So next, Elizabeth, do you have anything to add on the picking reviewers?
Sure. We have a different process than what Zach just described. So I will just give you a sense of what we are doing. And one thing to know is that at this point, every journal you're submitting to is using some kind of software like Editorial Manager or Scholar One. Know upfront that they are ridiculous to use, like just terrible. You will have a zillion passwords and you will still have to reset it every single time you want to log in. So be prepared. But the back end of our software, which is Editorial Manager, contains a lot of information about every individual in the system, and there's thousands and thousands, and their role as reviewer, their role as author, and then we have a place where we can leave comments. So if somebody behaves very poorly, we put those comments in. If you're a disgruntled author who sends unpleasant messages, or a reviewer who doesn't actually deliver a review or delivers a really low quality 2-sentence review, that's going to live forever in that software. So you don't want to probably be that person. But in the back end of Editorial Manager, we have our reviewer pool, and we get over 1,000 submissions a year. So we cannot rely on our board. That would cause everybody to leave our board immediately if they were reviewing that frequently. So we are looking in the manuscripts, and the assignment of, or the suggestion of reviewers is a staff task. Those are editorial assistants. They are looking at who do you cite in the manuscript. So they will look through the citations to try and get some ideas for who might be good reviewers. They're also using their own expertise to suss out who might have a really good fit with your manuscript. And then there's also an option in our journal, and not all journals do this, for you to both strike some reviewers and for you to suggest some reviewers. I wouldn't send too long a strike list, but you will be asked to strike people with whom you have a conflict of interest. So co-authors, advisors, and people who have definitely read the manuscript and will not be able to provide a blind peer review. Just strike them. Let the editors know. And then if you have the opportunity to suggest reviewers, this is something you should take. And by take the opportunity, I mean, use it to your advantage, because journal publication is hard enough. So if you're going to be able to suggest some reviewers, suggest people who are going to take the work on its own terms, who you think will be friendly to your approach. But most importantly, suggest people who are likely to actually accept the invitation to review, because reviewer fatigue is real and it's terrible. I would really strongly recommend against suggesting the most senior, like rock stars of the field that you're working in. They are the most likely to not be available because everybody's suggesting them, and because honestly, sometimes some people get to a point where they believe their time is too valuable to review, and so they're just maybe not even responding, which will make the process very protracted. So I just would caution you to even if there's like a demigod of the field, they may not be your demigod. So yeah, I think that's it.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Next, Alia.
Thank you. So we receive about 700 manuscripts, and I think we desk reject half or slightly more than a half even. Our board is only 32 people. So these are very much people that we go to review, but we also don't want to overwhelm them, because there's a certain understanding that they should be reviewing certain number of papers for us a year, but no more than that. And so we very much rely on reviewers outside of the editorial board. So we do have we use Manuscript Central, and there's a database of reviewers you can sort of search. But I think what Elizabeth said about references is probably the most common way to find reviewers. And I have a colleague who actually believes in strategically citing. And I sort of started to think about this. So you cite at the beginning people that you kind of want to be asked first. And if you need to cite someone, but you don't want them to review your work necessarily because it's not, you kind of try to kind of pack it away, hide it away, so they would not be the first ones to cite. Because sometimes you have to cite people, and if you avoid citing them, that's a kind of a red flag. So you have to, but you can do it strategically in a way that you kind of pack them away. It's interesting for me to know that, and I know some journals actually explicitly ask you to suggest reviewers or take your suggestions. We actually don't. We don't take suggestions of reviewers at all, and most people don't suggest, except that I've spoken about this in the past. If you were on this panel before, we have had a wave of letters that suggested fake reviewers. So names that did not exist, with email addresses, which was the trick. Basically, you would kind of put them into the database if you were gullible, and that email was connected to probably something which is kind of an offshoot of a paper mill, where kind of these reviews will be coming in. We never tried this, and maybe when I get a little less busy, I will try to follow some of those leads and see what happens. But we never did. And then sometimes these are real people, but their emails are fake. And we alerted some of the people that we knew whose names were used in these kinds of letters. And the most interesting thing that we have gotten, we sort of stopped getting them because we kind of wrote very stern letters in response to the authors that submitted them over maybe a course of a year or two. But in the past, we've gotten quite a few. And the interesting thing is that these fake people were the same names that kind of went from, so this was clearly some sort of an organized, this fictitious kind of reviewers that sort of travel from paper to paper. So we don't kind of as a policy accept any suggestions. If people on occasion, and that happened very rarely, ask not to include certain reviewers, we typically honor that as long as there's an explanation for that. But most of the time, it's either editorial board members or kind of the references in your paper, or the managing editor's own expertise as to who would be a good person to review a paper that speaks about these issues. And I think Zach mentioned this, that we also try to sort of strike a balance between, let's say, an area study person, if it's something about another country or culture, and a methodologist, and someone who sort of, maybe whose expertise is in the theories that are used in this case. So that's an ideal team. Of course, given that the reviewers do not always agree, we try to kind of keep it balanced. It doesn't work always like that, but ideally you would want people that kind of bring in different types of expertise to draw on this paper.
Great, very helpful. Thank you. And last, Kevin, anything to add about how you select reviewers?
Very little. I mean, I think our process is almost identical to Alia's. We make very little use of the editorial board. We mostly go out. If you don't know the area well enough, then you go to the references at the back of the paper and try to look up who the people are, or some of them by reputation. We don't accept recommendations for reviewers. Very rarely somebody will write saying, please don't use Kevin Lang as my referee. He's biased against my paper for this reason. We'll generally honor that if it's only one or two, as long as there's somebody else who kind of shares a perspective with the person who's being vetoed. We don't have to, but we'll generally respect that. As I said, basically the process is identical to what Alia said, so let me not add to the time.
Great, thank you for that. So now I'll bounce things back to Ariane.
Wonderful. Well, this next question is a bit of a lightning round question. The number one reason why a manuscript is rejected at your journals. Whoever would like to jump in first, go for it.
Well, I think that probably by frequency, I think it would be fit. It's just because we just reject so many papers, and most of them are just not a good fit, because it's clear to me from just looking at even an abstract that the person has no idea what our journal is about. They've never seen it, they've never read it, and so it's just not a good fit. But obviously, as you get through, the process, there's other reasons that become more important once you kind of clear that hurdle. But I'll leave it at that.
I would say that either the editor or the referees don't think that it's going to have enough of an impact.
Good answer.
I kind of similar to Kevin's response. There's a limited contribution beyond the specific setting or context. So like a narrow focus or a study of a particular school in a particular country or a type of program, and they didn't attach to broader literature frameworks, implications.
Thank you.
Similar, we desk reject about half, so those are usually fit. And then after that, we still get some more fit, but then also type of work we don't publish. Sometimes the work just uh, um, doesn't pass muster. It's not rigorous enough. It's not mature enough. It's too narrow, things like that. And reviewer, I think it's really, I mean, this may come up later, but it's unfortunately not a full meritocracy. There's luck involved, and a good reviewer draw is good luck. And sometimes there's just not a good reviewer draw. And it's really unfortunate that once things are published, or we think about it as a meritocracy, but there is also some luck involved.
Thank you for mentioning luck. That's such an important point. Debbie.
I guess I would just, to answer that, then we'll go to the next question. My journal Health and Social Behavior desk rejects about 65%, and the main reason is fit. So someone who submits a straight epi paper, meaning just a descriptive health paper, but no theory. So that's at the desk reject. After reject with review, it's mainly two things. One is the contribution, the magnitude of the contribution isn't sufficient. We need to know that you're doing something new, not just substantively, but then theoretically. The other is the generic box I'll call execution. Some papers do have a fatal flaw methodologically, or some are just methodologically so weak that we don't trust that the reviewer could make satisfactory revisions. And we have to reject 90% of papers. So unless it's anything less than really well executed, it's not going to pass muster there. Great. So I think we're transitioning to our next question. Did everybody chime in on the number one reason their manuscript was rejected?
Yep.
Perfect. So now we have another lightning round, which is much more uplifting. We've been talking a lot about rejection, but now we want to talk about the more positive end. And so what words of inspiration or encouragement would each of you give to aspiring authors? What mantra might you share to empower and inspire our audience members today? And we'll start with whoever wants to go first.
I'll be happy to start. And I think that it's really important to know that there is a home for your manuscript. If you are persistent, even if you don't hit immediately, there is a home for there's a home for your work, and it's a process sometimes trying to find it. The other thing I want to say is, if you haven't submitted and gotten reviews before, it's good to be prepared for the fact that it is a bracing experience, and that's a euphemism. It's very difficult to see your work through the eyes of others, and reviewers. I will temper some reviews. I'll ask reviewers to change language, but reviewers have a weird way of forgetting what it's like to receive feedback when they write their feedback. And some people are just not particularly sensitive to tone. But it can be very difficult if you are sensitive, which many people are, and if you have a lot invested in the piece. But it does get better. And over time, you are going to find that you're able to respond to that process more productively and feel less stung by it. And you should not be discouraged. Like every single person, like those of us who can see the back end of this, know that the most senior, well-published, highly respected, famous celebrities in your field get brutal criticism and sometimes send in like work that's not fully finished or isn't very good. So it's happening to everyone, even if everyone's not seeing it. If you really think you might benefit from some evidence that this is true, I would encourage people who have an interest in following up. There's a member of my field, political theorist in political science, who's at the top of the field, has been recruited by the best programs in the world and turned some of them down. And he keeps, his name is Arash Abizadeh. He keeps online a shadow CV showing the genealogy of each piece and all the places that it was rejected at before it got published, including some that he, I think, made the decision to not continue to pursue. Maybe they got folded into a book or something like that. But it's astonishing how much rejection somebody who is just considered one of the best political theorists of his generation has experienced. So you're not alone.
Elizabeth, can you put the link in the chat possibly so that because I would be curious to look at that as well.
It's
Yeah.
honestly the most validating thing. I will do that. I'm gonna put my camera just quickly on off so I can just find that.
Yep.
Great. And a
Thank
great reminder, it's a numbers game. The more you publish, the more you have rejected on the grant and paper front. So next, who else has words of inspiration or encouragement for aspiring authors?
I may not be an inspiration, but sort of the practical advice, and I think it ties in. There's a question for me in the chat about how to balance kind of the importance of contextualizing your research that's focused on one particular country with the fact that we're looking for something kind of that makes more of a general argument. So my advice if you're just starting out, my advice actually is to find a journal where you want to publish and find a recent paper that was published in this journal that you admire, and kind of do an autopsy of this paper, do kind of reverse engineer it, sort of ask yourself sort of what does the paper do structurally speaking? Like what does it accomplish in the abstract? What does it accomplish in introduction? What is the purpose and what kind of things are accomplished in all of the different parts of the paper? And you will see, for example, the answer to the questioner in the chat, you want to publish something on a specific country, but you're also concerned about how that paper will be accepted by a journal that looks for kind of more general arguments. Find a paper that sort of accomplishes something similar, that's focused on a particular country, but it's been published at SCR, and sort of see how they kind of balance that focus on one country with I suppose, the theoretical argument that travels beyond your case and says something to people that are not necessarily studying that particular context of that particular country. And also look at how they're able to kind of frame the paper broad in theoretical terms, probably, but also add enough context about this particular case that makes it kind of a contextualized paper that, however, speaks to broader audience. It's not easy to do, but I think if you have specific examples in front of you that have been successfully published, you can kind of teach yourself by looking at the kind of the way that this paper put together as how they accomplish those things, how much space and time they spent on discussing those certain things, what is the order in which they introduce kind of these different components. It usually is very helpful. I've done it for like a really big paper I published at the beginning of my career. I've literally taken a paper that was very similar, published in the same top journal, and just kind of took it apart and kind of tried to write in a very similar style, and it worked. So good luck with that. It's actually a fun process. You kind of learn a lot from this sort of dissection or autopsy.
Great. Thank you for that. And thank you, Elizabeth, for putting the link in the chat. So next, Kevin and Zach, your words of inspiration / encouragement for aspiring authors.
I'll jump in. It's a process for sure, and it can be a long process. So I think controlling what you can control is something to try to do. And so I mentioned earlier, start the response as soon as possible and work on it. We all get busy, and whether, I know one colleague who works on one thing at a time, which I find fascinating and kind of impressive. But most of us I think, are working on multiple things. And so being organized about that and trying to kind of engage in the process and think about the feedback as an academic discussion. Try not to take it personally. It's hard when you're starting out. And Elizabeth was right. Reviewers, I don't know what happens. Sometimes just seem unnecessarily harsh, or maybe they don't realize the tone. And so, even when that's the case, just try to think about it as improving the piece and getting it back out there, and moving on to the next. And really good luck with all of it.
Great. Thank you. And Kevin.
So before I try to inspire, let me also give one piece of advice, which is it is possible to communicate with editors. You shouldn't abuse it. Right? It's not a matter of basically sending me your manuscript and asking whether I'm going to desk reject it. That's not appropriate. But if referee reports seem to contradict each other, writing to me about which one I should follow, um, that sort of thing, you know, I don't object if I wrote, I think this would be appropriate for a more specialized journal. If you write to me as a junior person, is there a particular one that you would recommend? I'm happy to do that. And I think at least the other editors I've dealt with in economics are happy to do that as well, as long as we can't do that with every person who submits, but if you don't abuse it, it's fine. Uh, in terms of inspiration, I guess I have two anecdotes which tell similar stories. When I was a new assistant professor, one of my assistant professor colleagues had a paper that I thought was very good. And by that time, it was 3 or 4 years out. He had submitted that paper all sorts of places. He'd been rejected from places where, quite honestly, if I had a paper accepted there, I wouldn't have put it on my CV. And then somebody said to him, you know, I think the current editor of the American Economic Review, which is one of our super elite journals, would like this. And he sent the paper there and it got accepted. Um, and so there is a lot of randomness, there is a lot of luck, especially if your paper is a little bit offbeat, if it's quite original. And perhaps even more inspiring than that, George Akerlof's Market for Lemons paper was rejected at the first 4 journals it was sent to. It eventually won him the Nobel Prize. So there's a lot of luck. The referees may be demigods. In fact, they are, but doesn't mean they're right. And so believe in yourself, make changes that I would say, if you read what the referee wrote, I'm not talking about a revise and resubmit here. I'm talking after a rejection. If you agree what the referees wrote, make the changes. If you're hearing the same thing several times, make the changes. And otherwise, just figure out what the next journal is.
The wisdom I heard early in my career is the way that academics show they care is by giving feedback. So just think these reviewers, they're not paid a dime. You don't know who they are, and they're spending their entire Sunday afternoon reading your paper and writing up 2 single-space pages of comments when they would actually rather be cleaning their house or writing their own paper. And if they thought your paper had no contribution, they wouldn't dedicate their time to it. So just kind of take it in the spirit it's intended, even if some people could use a little bit of editing in the tone of their work. It probably comes from a well-intended place, even if the words are not coming out in that way. But and you all know more about your topic than anybody, and so really just gives you an opportunity to shine, even if it doesn't shine at its best on the first round of review. So what we can do now is, I'll bounce things back to Ariane, we can start to take questions from the audience.
When an author finds a review unfair or biased or problematic, how do they appeal that decision? And can an appeal result in a successful publication?
I'll take that. At least in my field, there generally are not formal processes for appeals. I know there are in some of the sciences. If you want to appeal, you better have a very strong reason, and you better do it very politely and apologetically. I, as an editor, have accepted appeals, but most of the time, my response is simply, if you think we got it wrong, send it somewhere else. There are lots of competitive journals, and it will get in somewhere else. I have, in my very lengthy career with many, many rejections, I have appealed once when a paper sat at a journal for 13 months. We got back 2 reports, one which was just literally stupid, and the other which said this is really a very good idea, but it's already been written up in a working paper that was dated after our initial submission to the journal. And we thought we had pretty strong grounds for appealing at that point. And the appeal wasn't accepted, and we eventually did get the paper in the journal. You should be extremely polite if you do that. I knew you were politically biased against my paper. It does not get a good response from the editor. It gets the response, grow up.
Yeah, I would recommend against appealing unless you really believe that there has been something unfair. And so one common appeal we don't get many appeals, is I can address all of these concerns raised by the reviewers. Sometimes people perceive that a particular reviewer who they don't like was one of your reviewers. So I've had someone appeal say, I know that John Doe was one of the reviewers, or someone from his shop. They don't like me. And I was like, I've never even heard of this person. Like, the reviewers were experts in the field. They're not anybody that you named. So I'm sorry this happened, but no. And then the other one is, sometimes they just don't like the decision. And I explain in very clear detail why I rejected it. People might not like a decision, but if they can respect the process, they will accept it. So I'll say, even though the reviews you saw look quite positive in the confidential comments to editors, which is something we get, that's when the reviewers will say things like, I tried to sound constructive, but this was a really weak paper. Or on the metadata, they will click off that the contribution of the paper is minimal, or that there's a 20% chance of successful review. The reviewer not only sends a comment to UC, they send us comments and then click off all these closed-ended questions. So you're seeing the rejection is the most impression managed positive rejection possible. So unless you really think there's been some kind of malfeasance in the process, go somewhere else. I think it'll just save you a lot of time and anxiety, but others may disagree with that harsh response.
I'll just add, appeals are very unusual. We don't get a lot of them. I have heard from APSR that they get a ton of appeals, and particularly entitled appeals. So I think kind of may depend on how people perceive the team in place. We don't reveal to authors what the recommendations of each individual reviewer, what they were. So in addition to not assuming you know who the reviewer is, it's really best to try and not suss out, unless you have some bit of evidence, what the reviewer recommended or which reviewer recommended what, because it's very often the case that you don't know. And if you do want to appeal, you do have to be deferential. The other thing I would recommend is find at all costs a procedural reason for appealing. This idea that you can do it, or there was bias, or the reviewers are wrong, that's going to be harder. That's a really hard road to go down, unless there's something just very clearly, demonstrably false about something a reviewer said. Even inconsistent reviews, that often won't be a grounds for a successful appeal. The procedure is. And so somebody mentioned the amount of time that something has sat. It may also, sometimes it's the case, whether or not something has sat for a long time, that a reviewer can't be brought back in for some reason, or there's some other procedural irregularity. But I would look for that, and use that, because that's going to be your most likely route to a sympathetic editor. Otherwise, you're kind of undercutting their authority. And what happens is they remember that the next time you submit.
Thank you. We have I guess a last question from Edna, if you want to just pose your question directly.
Yeah, great. Thank you. My name is Edna. I'm a first year grad student at BU, and I'm just in the process trying to think about publication. And I know you guys were discussing a little bit about how you should craft your letters in response to reviewers. And my question is, if you are kind of not wedded to the theoretical framework you're trying to push or what you're trying to do, how do you respond respectfully and with humility, but still advocating for yourself?
Great question. Thoughts?
I would highly recommend, if you're in that position, using a little bit of media training. in which you take the thing that you were asked about and agree with it, and then proceed to then disagree with it. So in other words, accept and treat it with respect, and then add a, but also, I see things in this way. I would not, there's a real limit to how much you can object to within a set of reviews. So I would really pick carefully, because you will quickly run up against that threshold. I would treat the reviewer who's going to see that set of comments with a great deal of respect, and I would mostly agree with them, even if then you want to find a clever way to turn around and say, so I've thought about it in this way, and then kind of hold your ground a little bit, but you have to do it very deftly.
I just want to add also is that in the end, this is your paper. And, as much as we were saying that everyone, I think, was saying that you have to be responding to every comment and you have to be differential, in the end, you don't have to do everything that each reviewer asks you. And sometimes it's impossible because they ask you to do different things. And, there are reviews where the reviewer basically asks you to write a different paper. And it's just impossible to do, and you shouldn't. I mean, my advice is that you shouldn't. That probably means that you should, unfortunately, this is the question of luck. This was an unlucky choice for reviewer. Unfortunately, you may need to go elsewhere to publish this paper, unless you want to rewrite the paper, which I don't usually advise. It's not, you already wrote a paper, and apparently it's been presented and commented on. So there's a kind of this collective sort of intelligence already kind of looking at it and giving you comments. So it's a paper that's already been kind of matured in a sense. So it's an unfair comment, but sometimes you do get reviews where reviewers saying this is a completely wrong framing, you should do that. And it's a choice. Do you want to reframe it or do you want to send it elsewhere? But you don't have to. It's your paper in the end. You don't have to write anything that anyone tells you if you believe in your kind of framing.
I think that's a wonderful point to conclude on. It's your paper. Agency, we get to own what we write and control this process as much as we can in the face of these uncertainties and demigods that we've been discussing today. So I think that brings us to the close. It's 2:30 and I want to be respectful of people's time. So in closing, I just want to thank Debbie and Shannon and our fabulous panelists for sharing their time with us and providing their insights about this often opaque process, incredibly useful for all of us. So thanks for attending. Thanks for this fabulous programming. Reach out to us if you have any questions that weren't addressed.
Great.
Happy holidays.